The heat wave had settled over Manhattan like a thick, unmoving curtain that refused to lift, and even at nearly 11 at night the city glowed under the weight of 40 degrees Celsius, the kind of oppressive heat that made the air shimmer around streetlights and turned every breath into something heavy and humid. And by the time Emma Reyes reached the 72nd floor of the Hayes Tech Tower, she already felt the sweat gathering at the back of her neck beneath her dark hair and the dull pounding in her temples that warned she was pushing her body too far again. But she could not afford to stop, because this night shift was the only thing keeping rent from swallowing her whole, so she pressed forward even as her vision swam a little each time she blinked. The entire floor had shut down early because the building cooling system had malfunctioned and most employees had rushed out hours before leaving the huge glass corridors silent and strangely echoing. And Emma, exhausted from her second job at the bar, moved slowly through offices lit only by emergency strips. Her breaths shallow, her cotton uniform sticking to her skin. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, tugged gently at the top buttons of her collar to let more air touch her overheated skin, and tried to steady herself. She had done hundreds of late-night shifts before, but something about the heat tonight felt different, pressing on her chest, making each inhale feel like a climb. She stepped into a darkened hallway to collect herself and whispered to no one in particular that she wished the world would give her a moment to breathe. Then forced her feet forward toward the last room on her cleaning schedule. The CEO private office, a place she had never seen lit except through the crack of its polished door. She reached for the handle, expecting the room to be empty like the rest of the floor, and when the door opened silently, she stepped inside immediately, enveloped by the cool, faint smell of cedar and ink that lingered even without an air conditioner running. And she exhaled in relief, thinking finally she had found the one place in the building that held a little stillness. The office was dim except for the glow from the skyline through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the glass walls into mirrors, and in the reflection Emma caught her own image. Cheeks flushed, hair frizzed from humidity. Blouse collar loosened just enough to keep her from fainting. She let her head fall back for a second and whispered as if confessing to the quiet, "I thought I was alone," because in that moment she believed she truly was. She did not hear the elevator ding from the private access hallway, and she did not hear footsteps approaching, not over the hum in her ears from the heat, but she did hear the electronic lock click behind her and turned slowly. Her heart tripping over itself because standing there framed in the doorway was the last person she expected to see at this hour. Alexander Hayes himself, the youngest billionaire in Manhattan. The man the newspapers called unshakable. Hayes, though the shock that crossed his face made that nickname seem suddenly fragile. He froze completely, as if every part of him stalled at the sight of her. Not because she looked inappropriate, but because she was clearly on the verge of collapsing, her hand gripping the edge of the desk to steady herself, her breaths sharp and uneven. He took a step towards her, and his voice, usually razor-cold in every corporate interview she had ever overheard, softened in a way that startled them both as he said, "You are overheating. Sit down now." And before she could protest, he shrugged off the dark suit jacket he had been wearing and draped it gently around her shoulders, the expensive fabric cool from the air of the elevator, immediately easing the burning on her skin. Emma blinked in confusion and embarrassment, her mind racing with fears of losing her job. But before she could speak, Alexander crouched slightly to meet her eye level and assessed her face with a focus so intense she could not look away. "You are minutes from heat stroke," he murmured. "You should never have been working up here alone with the system out," and he reached for his phone as though ready to call medical staff. But she shook her head, breathless, insisting she just needed a minute, just needed air, just needed the world to slow down. He hesitated, and that hesitation struck her harder than the heat, because the man famed for making billion-dollar decisions without blinking looked truly uncertain for the first time. She tried to stand straighter but swayed slightly, and he steadied her with one careful hand on her elbow. And in that small gesture she noticed something she had never been close enough to see before: the worn leather strap of the watch on his wrist. A vintage piece with a faint scratch down the side. Its face, classic and understated, something that clearly meant more than fashion. Something he touched once lightly with his thumb as if it grounded him. The moment stretched as their eyes met, layers of shock, shame, and an unexpected compassion weaving in the charged air between them, and Emma felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the heat wave settle at the base of her throat. She tried to step back, mumbling an apology for being in his office, for looking unprofessional, for inconveniencing him. But he shook his head slowly and said, "You thought you were alone," as though he were repeating her whisper back to her, almost wondering what loneliness would make someone say such a thing aloud. She could not answer, not, with her pulse still racing and her limbs shaking, so she just nodded and wrapped the jacket tighter around herself because somehow it made her feel seen rather than judged. Alexander moved to the window, tapped the control panel to activate emergency ventilation, and returned to stand a respectful distance from her, though his gaze softened each time it drifted back to her face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence thick but strangely gentle, and Emma felt the world tilt slightly, as if this night, this room, this unexpected encounter between a woman fighting simply to survive and a man who never let his own armor crack had become the beginning of a road none of them had meant to stand on, but could no longer avoid. Alexander Hayes had always been a man whose reputation reached the room before he did a man newspapers called the calmest mind on Wall Street and the coldest heart in Manhattan, the CEO who dismantled billion-dollar mergers without raising his voice and walked through disasters as if fire bent around him. But tonight, as he stood alone in his penthouse 30 blocks from the office, he could not shake the image of Emma Reyes nearly collapsing in his private room. Her breaths unsteady, her eyes glassy from the heat, her voice thin but stubborn, as she insisted she just needed a moment, and his mind kept replaying the tremble in her hands when he had draped his jacket over her shoulders. He had returned home because he thought distance would clear his thoughts, but instead the silence inside the vast space pressed down on him, echoing the same suffocating emptiness he had lived with for years, since the scandal that took his father from him. That single event that taught him emotions were liabilities and vulnerability, was a weapon others would gladly use against you. The penthouse, all glass and steel and minimalism, reflected pieces of him that he had once believed were strengths, but now felt like hollow victories, and as he walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, he caught his reflection in the darkened window, noticing something unfamiliar in his own expression, a strain around his eyes as if he were fighting something he did not yet understand. He set the glass down untouched and paced for a moment before finally sitting on the edge of his couch, elbows on his knees, fingers brushing the worn leather strap of the vintage watch on his wrist. The only object he kept from his father, a grounding anchor he never removed. He had faced reporters who tried to goad him into anger, survived executives who wanted his downfall, and endured betrayals from partners who smiled while they carved out pieces of his company. Yet the sight of one overheated maid struggling to breathe had rooted him to the spot more thoroughly than any crisis ever had. He remembered her whisper, the soft, "I thought I was alone," spoken to the room before she realized anyone else existed, a sentence that struck him in a way he could not shake, because he knew exactly what it felt like to believe you were the only person left in the world who had to carry everything alone. He reached for his phone before he realized what he was doing and stopped himself halfway, questioning why he wanted to check if she had made it home safely, why he was tempted to call building security to confirm she had recovered, and why his chest tightened at the idea that she might still be struggling somewhere in the dark. Instead, he opened a browser and scanned the latest headlines about himself, seeing the familiar cold language that painted him as untouchable, the man who never flinched, never faltered, never cared, and for the first time he felt the weight of those descriptions like a chain instead of armor. When the heat in his chest refused to settle, he stood abruptly, walking to the small console where he kept his work tablet, and with a sharp exhale he opened the internal HR system and typed Emma Reyes into the search bar. Something he knew he should not do, but justified because she had been endangered on company property, and he needed to understand why she was even on that floor after hours. Her employee file opened, and the first thing he saw was the note about her 2 part-time jobs. Then the section about caring for her 12-year-old brother, then the notation about her mother whose chronic illness required treatment she could barely afford, and finally the update from 3 months prior saying her Bronx apartment building had raised rent by nearly 20%, putting her at risk of eviction. Alexander stared at the screen longer than he should have, absorbing facts that tightened something in him he had spent years refusing to acknowledge because struggle was not foreign to him. And the line in her file that said employee has been taking additional shifts to maintain housing stability lingered in his mind like a bruise he could not ignore. He imagined her walking up 72 floors of a tower with no working air system. Because she could not afford to call out sick, imagined her pushing herself past exhaustion because failure was simply not an option. Imagined her whispering to no one because she had no one, and he felt something shift so sharply inside him he had to stand again. He closed the tablet, paced toward the balcony, and stepped outside into the heavy night air where Manhattan lights flickered beneath him like restless stars, and he tried to tell himself that Emma was simply an employee who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nothing more, nothing less. But the words refused to settle because what he had seen in her eyes was not an accident or a coincidence, but a reflection of someone holding their world together with shaking hands. He pressed his palms against the railing and tilted his head back, breathing in the city heat, acknowledging only to himself that the sound of her voice, the whispered confession of thinking she was alone, had crawled into a part of him he always kept locked. The memory of her swaying on her feet returned again, and frustration surged that she had been forced to work in such conditions that no one had noticed how pale she had been, that the building systems had failed at all. And before he realized he was doing it, he grabbed his phone and called Angela Moore, the HR manager, not caring about the late hour. She answered groggily and startled when she realized who was calling, but he spoke quietly, evenly, the way he always did, instructing her to prepare a full report on Emma Rhea's schedule workload and department oversight by morning. Angela, confused but compliant, asked if there had been an incident, and Alexander hesitated, almost admitting that something had happened, almost revealing that he had carried a maid through the hall when her knees buckled from heat stroke, but instead he simply said, "We need to evaluate working conditions on all upper floors," and ended the call. When he set the phone down, he looked once more at the skyline, letting the city lights steady him, and accepted silently that something had changed because for the first time in years he wanted to understand a person instead of avoiding them, and that realization unsettled him more than any hostile takeover ever had. Emma awoke the next morning with the kind of exhaustion that felt stitched into her bones, the kind that came from too many double shifts and too few hours of sleep. And as she lay in the small Bronx apartment she shared with her 12-year-old brother Liam, she felt the familiar pressure in her chest tighten when she remembered how close she had come to passing out in the Haystack Tower, how she had stumbled into the CEO office without realizing it, and how Alexander Hayes himself had appeared at the worst possible moment. She replayed the scene in her mind with growing panic, wondering whether she had broken some policy by being on the 72nd floor alone, or whether a security camera had recorded her whispering to the empty room, and the thought of losing her job pressed on her so heavily she could barely swallow. Rent was due in 10 days, and her building manager had already warned her that another late payment would mean an eviction notice, and with her mother in a long-term care facility and medical bills piling up, someone had to keep everything afloat. Someone had to keep the lights on and the fridge stocked for Liam, and that someone was her. She dressed quickly in her uniform and barely tasted her coffee as she hurried Liam through breakfast, telling him not to worry when he asked why she looked pale, insisting she had just been tired, when in truth her mind had not stopped spinning since the moment Alexander had placed his jacket on her shoulders. By the time she reached the Haystack lobby, her pulse was hammering as if preparing for impact, and as she rode the elevator up, she rehearsed explanations that felt more like apologies, preparing for Angela from HR to tell her she had crossed a boundary she never meant to cross. When the elevator doors opened on the administration floor, Angela was already waiting. Expression, unreadable clipboard tucked against her side, and Emma felt her stomach drop because nothing good ever started with an HR manager calling you into an office at 8 in the morning. Angela gestured for her to follow, and Emma did, sitting where instructed in the small conference room, hands clasped tightly to hide the slight tremble in her fingers. Angela began with a tone carefully neutral, mentioning last night the heat wave, the malfunctioning cooling system, and the safety protocols that should have been in place. And Emma forced herself to breathe as she apologized immediately, saying she had not meant to cause any trouble, she had only tried to finish her tasks. She had not realized she was entering the CEO office, she knew it looked unprofessional, but she had been overheated and disoriented. She braced for reprimand, but instead, Angela glanced down at her notes and said something that did not make sense. At first, something about performance reviews and the company reassessing needs in executive residential management. Emma blinked confused until Angela finally explained that the CEO had reviewed staffing placement personally and decided she was being promoted to a newly created position, private residence assistant, assigned to the 78th floor penthouse with a pay raise, meal stipend, and fixed schedule, separate from general housekeeping duties. The words hit Emma like a shockwave, so unexpected she almost laughed, almost cried, sitting frozen as she tried to understand how stepping into the wrong room had turned into a promotion that could save her entire life, and she stammered something about not being qualified because she had only ever cleaned corporate floors, not personal residences. Angela shook her head, relaying Alexander's reasoning almost verbatim, saying he believed Emma demonstrated composure under pressure and a rare level of discretion, qualities critical for someone working near executive quarters. The phrase composure under pressure made Emma flush because she remembered how shaky she had been. Yet he had apparently seen something else entirely, something she did not know she had. She tried to refuse, gently insisting she was grateful. But the situation last night had been an accident. She did not want the CEO to think she expected anything from it, but Angela gave her a faint, sympathetic smile, the kind women shared when they recognized unspoken fear and said the CEO did not base decisions on accidents. Emma nodded slowly, overwhelmed, but fear twisted inside her when she imagined how the others in housekeeping would react, because already they whispered about anyone who went near the upper floors, and a sudden promotion connected to the CEO residence would ignite rumors she could never outrun. Her mind spiraled when she imagined being labeled as someone trying to climb by proximity, someone exploiting attention she did not want, and the idea of anyone thinking that of her made her throat tighten. Still, she could not ignore the truth. She needed this job more than she needed pride, more than she needed comfort, because Liam needed her, and the bills needed paying, and her mother needed treatment, and refusing a steady income out of fear would be irresponsible. When Angela ended the meeting by handing her a new badge and access code, Emma held them carefully, feeling the weight of possibility and risk tangled together. She left the room only to find two coworkers glancing at her from across the hall, conversations cutting off mid-sentence, their eyes flicking to the new badge around her neck. The flush that rose to her face burned more than last night's heat, but she kept walking toward the service elevator that would take her to the penthouse for orientation. As the doors slid shut, she exhaled slowly, gripping the railing, whispering to herself that she would ignore the whispers no matter how sharp they became, because she could not let anything jeopardize the one chance she had to pull her life back from the edge. When she reached the upper floors, a member of executive staff greeted her and led her to a small lounge, explaining duties in broad strokes, but all Emma could think about was the moment she would inevitably see Alexander again, the man who had seen her at her most vulnerable, the man who had made a decision that changed her entire trajectory without asking for anything in return. She wondered whether he expected gratitude, whether he regretted helping her, whether he had only acted out of guilt seeing her nearly collapse, and these uncertainties pressed against her ribs. Still, she straightened her spine and told herself that no matter what happened next, she would do the job with the same quiet discipline she brought to every corner of her life, because losing this opportunity was not an option, not after everything she had endured to keep her family together. Emma stepped out of the private service elevator onto the 78th floor and immediately felt as though she had entered another reality entirely, a world so far removed from the Bronx apartment where she and Liam shared a single window and a wobbly kitchen table that she almost hesitated to breathe, unsure if even the air here cost more than she made in a week. The penthouse stretched out before her in polished expanses of glass and steel-clean lines that reflected the Manhattan skyline in every surface, and the silence felt so absolute it bordered on unnerving, as if the entire floor held its breath waiting for something to move. She stepped forward carefully, her soft-soled shoes barely making a sound on the gleaming floor, and she found herself pausing at the first wall of windows where the city lights spilled upward like a rising tide of gold, the kind of view she had only ever glimpsed from the street below. Yet, despite the beauty, the place felt strangely hollow, like a museum curated by someone who understood structure but not warmth. And she noticed immediately what was missing. No family photos on shelves, no books with dog-eared pages, no forgotten cup on the counter, no softness in the furniture. Everything looked intentional, controlled, perfectly arranged, just like the man who lived here. She followed the checklist she had been given, starting with the living area, smoothing the edges of the minimalist furniture, noting how each item seemed to echo Alexander Hayes. Reputation, sharp lines, quiet, strength. Nothing unnecessary, nothing wasted. As she wiped the already spotless console, she noticed a single object resting there. The velvet stand where Alexander must set his vintage watch when showering or changing, positioned with such precision that she knew instantly it was not an item he ever misplaced. She wondered how many years he had worn it, whether it had belonged to his father, why he touched it so often, the way people touch things that tethered them when the world became too loud. She moved through the penthouse, checking kitchen surfaces, organizing the sparse pantry, adjusting the blinds in his office area, according to the orientation chart included in her training notes. And while she worked, she caught glimpses of herself reflected across multiple panels of glass, a small figure moving through an enormous space that seemed built for someone with a life far larger than hers. When she reached the study, she paused, taking in the perfect arrangement of pens, the single-framed architectural blueprint on the wall, the bookshelves lined with volumes on finance and leadership, all untouched enough that she suspected he read them electronically instead. As she adjusted the blinds, she noticed how a beam of morning light cut across the room and landed exactly where his chair would be. With a quiet instinct, she shifted the angle so the sunlight would warm the space without glare, something she used to do back at the bar when regulars needed comfort but never asked for it. She moved on to the bedroom corridor, stepping lightly, aware that she was entering the most private area of someone who barely let anyone near him, and she breathed out in relief when she discovered the door was slightly open but the room empty. Typical of him, she thought even his absence felt controlled. She straightened the duvet, aligned the pillows, and folded the corner of the sheet in the style she had learned from her mother long before life became heavy. As she worked, she could not shake the feeling that she was learning him through the silence he left behind, understanding him not through conversation, but through the tiny imprints of habit scattered through the clean spaces, the way he preferred water warm instead of cold, the subtle indentation on the floor near the balcony indicating where he stood most nights watching the city, the faint rearranging of the pen placed nearest his notebook suggesting a restless hand. She found herself softening slightly, realizing he was not the hard-edged figure the news portrayed, but someone who lived behind carefully built walls. She was finishing the last of her checklist when the soft hiss of the elevator sounded the private one she knew belonged only to him, and her breath caught because she had not expected to see him this early or this close after last night's encounter. She stepped into the hallway just as Alexander walked in, suit jacket draped over one arm, his expression composed, but his eyes flicking immediately toward her as though checking she was truly there. For a second, the two of them stood in the quiet corridor surrounded by glass and steel, neither moving, both unsure who should speak first. Then Alexander gave a small nod, an acknowledgement that felt heavier than a greeting, and glanced around the penthouse with a faint shift of surprise in his eyes when he noticed the light adjustments, the organized spaces, the subtle ease she had added without changing anything fundamental. He walked closer and paused by the window where she had shifted the blinds, his gaze lingering on the soft spread of light across the floor, and with a tone lower than she had ever heard, he asked, "Why did you think you were alone last night?" The question struck her like a sudden breeze, and she hesitated, unsure whether he asked out of curiosity or something else entirely, something quieter. She swallowed and finally answered. "People like me usually are," her voice steady but small, because the truth did not need embellishment. His expression changed barely but unmistakably. A single breath deepening his chest as though her words cracked something open in him, and he looked at her. Not like an employee or an inconvenience, but like someone he genuinely wanted to understand. She turned away, first unsettled by the intensity in his eyes, and resumed her work. but she could feel his gaze following her steps, absorbing every detail as if learning her in the same way she had learned him through the objects he left behind. The silence between them was no longer cold, but charged with an unspoken connection. Neither asked for yet, neither could ignore. And as she finished her tasks and prepared to leave the penthouse, she felt something shift inside her. A quiet awareness that this world of glass, steel, and silence was no longer quite as distant as it had seemed when she first stepped through its doors. In the days that followed Emma's promotion, Alexander found himself doing something entirely uncharacteristic for a man whose life revolved around structured routines and airtight borders he rarely allowed anyone to cross. He began noticing her without meaning to, as if her presence had slipped into the edges of his awareness and refused to leave. And he caught himself searching for her silhouette whenever he stepped out of the elevator or passed the penthouse corridor. It started subtly, a glance toward the kitchen when he heard quiet footsteps. A longer pause near the living room when he sensed movement, but the awareness grew until it became a quiet pattern in his mornings and evenings, something he did not acknowledge aloud but could not stop. He told himself he needed to make sure she had adjusted to the penthouse responsibilities, that her fainting spell had not left lingering effects, that the scandal brewing between Hayes-Tech and Voscorp did not spill over into her already fragile life. Yet the truth sat heavier and far less rational in his chest. He found himself standing by the balcony at times, eyes drifting to the reflection behind him to see if she had entered with fresh linens or a cleaning kit, and on the rare mornings when their paths crossed, he felt a brief tightening in his throat. He could not explain the kind of reaction that belonged to a different version of him, one he had buried years ago. He tried to dismiss it, but the memory of her flushed face, the tremble in her voice when she whispered, "I thought I was alone," returned at the most inconvenient moments, stirring something in him that had nothing to do with obligation. Meanwhile, Emma, oblivious to the shifting undercurrents inside him, focused on doing her job with the discipline she had learned from surviving far too much, moving through the penthouse with quiet competence, unaware that Alexander had begun tracking the small things she did, the gentle rearranging of items she thought would make his day flow smoother. It was during one of his late-night reviews when he noticed a security report about a minor incident at Liam Reyes School, a bullying complaint that listed Emma as guardian. And though the matter appeared resolved, something in Alexander tightened sharply, an instinctive protective impulse that startled him. The next morning, he summoned a member of his private security team, instructing them with deliberate calm to discreetly monitor the school perimeter during afternoon hours. No contact, no interference unless necessary, just observation. And while the order was simple, the emotion behind it was not. He justified it as ensuring the well-being of an employee whose stability impacted her performance, but that excuse felt flimsy even to him, because the truth pulsed deeper, rooted in something far more personal. That evening, after a long negotiation meeting downtown, he stopped by a quiet bar near the financial district to take a brief breath before diving back into crisis planning with the legal team. But as he stepped inside, he froze for a moment, surprised to see Emma behind the counter. Hair pulled back, sleeves rolled up, moving with practiced precision as she slid drinks across polished wood. She had not seen him yet. Too focused on a customer asking for a complicated order, and Alexander watched her expression soften as she concentrated, her hands moving with efficient confidence. For a brief second, he felt something warm flicker in his chest, and he turned away before she looked up, unwilling to intrude on a space that clearly belonged to her world, not his. But fate, or whatever force kept pulling their paths together, intervened. A customer at the counter raised his voice impatiently, knocking over a glass and muttering something sharp about slow service. And before Emma could react, Alexander stepped forward, his tone low and calm as he told the man to back off because accidents happen and no one deserved to be spoken to like that. The customer, recognizing him, instantly paled and apologized profusely before retreating. And Emma blinked at Alexander in stunned confusion, not understanding how he had appeared at her secondary workplace or why he seemed oddly protective. She managed to thank you, but her cheeks warmed as she asked if he was following her. And Alexander immediately shook his head, flustered by the implication, explaining he had not known she worked here, that he was only stopping in before a meeting. She studied him for a long moment, clearly unconvinced but too polite to question further and return to her tasks, though her movements were more cautious now, more aware of his presence. As she prepared a latte for another customer, the scent stirred something in Alexander, a memory he had kept buried for nearly a decade. A memory of a night when he had been nothing more than a grieving son lost in a world that no longer made sense, standing in a small coffee shop at midnight while a young woman behind the counter handed him a warm cup and said gently, "You look like you need something warm." The moment hit him with such force he almost stepped back, his gaze snapping to Emma as she placed the drink on the counter with the same quiet grace he remembered, and realization crashed into him. She was the barista from that night. The stranger who had offered a kindness he had never forgotten, the moment of warmth that had kept him from spiraling after his father's death. She did not recognize him, and he understood why. Back then, he had been gaunt-shaken, wearing grief like a second skin. Nothing like the controlled executive he had become. He watched her for another heartbeat, emotions stirring he had not allowed himself to feel in years, a blend of gratitude, fear, and something he dared not name. When she approached to ask if he needed anything, he shook his head, managing to say he was fine, but his voice betrayed a subtle crack he hoped she did not hear. He left soon after stepping into the night with the memory of her kindness burning in his mind, and for the first time since his father's death, he felt the ground beneath him shift because she had been there in the moment he had been closest to breaking, and now she was here again, unknowingly knitting the edges of his fractured past back together. And as he walked toward the waiting car, he admitted silently that the growing connection he felt terrified him, because attachments were dangerous and vulnerability was a wound. He did not survive well yet. He could not stop the slow, steady pull, drawing him toward her. The corporate war between Hayes Tech and Voscorp had been simmering for months, an invisible battlefield of leaked rumors, hostile press releases, and carefully timed market manipulation. But until now, it had never touched Emma directly, never crawled into the corners of her daily life with such invasive force that it felt like the whole city had turned its eyes on her. And she realized too late that stepping into the penthouse world of a billionaire meant stepping into the line of fire whether she wanted to or not. It began on a Thursday morning when she left the building to buy fresh towels for the executive suite and noticed two men with cameras across the street, their lenses aimed suspiciously toward the revolving doors, and she brushed it off as typical Manhattan noise until she returned from the store and one of them snapped a photo the moment she stepped inside, the flash exploding in her peripheral vision like a strike of lightning. She heard her name muttered by one of them, a sound that made her skin crawl with confusion because no one outside her small life should have known who she was. Within an hour, the image appeared online, captioned with speculative poison that spiraled faster than any truth could chase a headline reading, "The Billionaire's Maid seen leaving Hayes Tower alone," sparking a wildfire of assumptions she never asked for and certainly did not deserve. By the next morning, the gossip blogs had created entire narratives about her, calling her mysterious, calling her lucky, calling her something far uglier, and she felt her stomach drop when a journalist emailed her personal inbox asking for a comment about her alleged involvement with Alexander Hayes. She deleted the message in panic, but the damage had already begun to seep into her real life. That evening, she arrived at her part-time bar job, only to have her manager pull her aside apologizing awkwardly, while explaining that the sudden media attention made the staff uncomfortable, that customers might assume things at the bar could not risk bad publicity, and that maybe she should take a week off. A week off meant a week without tips, without pay, without groceries. She left the bar numb, her uniform still smelling faintly of detergent and lemon cleaner from the penthouse, and by the time she reached the subway she felt the weight of everything crushing her from above and below, squeezing until she could barely breathe. When she arrived at Hayes Tech the next morning, the air inside the building felt heavier, as if every whisper from the lobby to the 78th floor echoed with her name, and she sensed the shift in tone among the housekeeping staff, their glances sharp and their murmurs colder, as though proximity to the penthouse had transformed her into someone suspicious rather than someone simply doing her job. She kept her head down, focusing on the tasks she could control, but the tension crawled under her skin until she felt raw. Meanwhile, Alexander was in back-to-back meetings with the crisis management team reviewing the latest smear campaign from Voss Corp, unaware at first that Emma had become collateral damage, but he sensed something was wrong the moment he stepped out of his office and found her straightening towels with trembling hands, her eyes too bright, her breaths too shallow. Before he could speak, a notification buzzed across his tablet and he saw one of the online articles featuring Emma's photograph beside a headline speculating wildly about their relationship, and something inside him snapped so sharply he felt the jolt in his spine. He dismissed his next meeting without explanation, storming down the hall with a cold fury that made employees flatten against the walls as he passed, and when he reached the executive conference room, he slammed his hand on the table so hard the sound cracked through the air like a gunshot, startling the legal team mid-sentence. His voice was low but dangerous as he demanded to know how internal information about the penthouse staff had leaked, who had allowed paparazzi to access private documents, and which department had failed to protect an employee from unnecessary exposure. No one answered quickly enough, and in a rare break from his controlled demeanor, he struck the edge of the glass table with the heel of his palm, causing a thin fracture to snake across the surface. The room fell silent. No one had ever seen him lose composure. Not once. Not ever. He left without another word, shoulders' rigid jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles stood out against his skin. When he returned to the penthouse, he found Emma in the kitchen cleaning the counter, even though it did not need cleaning, her movements stiff and mechanical like someone trying not to fall apart. He approached her slowly and said, "Emma, look at me." But she could not bring herself to meet his eyes, terrified of what he might say, terrified of losing the only job standing between her and eviction. She managed to whisper, "I lost my second job last night," the words so soft they barely held shape, and something inside Alexander twisted painfully because he understood then that the war against him had reached her doorstep. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair before lowering his voice even further as he asked, "Did they fire you because of me?" She shook her head, but he saw the truth anyway, saw the way shame and fear tangled in her eyes, and the guilt that surged in him felt suffocating. He reached for the back of a chair to steady himself, not because he was physically unbalanced, but because his mind churned with a rare helplessness he did not know how to manage. The protective instinct he felt was raw and immediate, stronger than anything he had expected, and yet he could not undo what had already happened. Could not stop the rumors or erase the headlines, not while Voss Corp continued feeding the media with calculated malice. Emma finally looked up and saw the crack in his expression, the way his composure faltered for the first time, and in that split second she realized he was not angry with her, but with the world that had forced her into its collateral. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths, and neither of them noticed until later that when Alexander lifted his hand from the counter, his watch had shifted slightly, the strap askew, as though even the one object he always controlled had felt the tremor running through him. And Emma, watching him struggle to breathe through the fury he tried to hide, felt the ground shift beneath her because the man the world believed unshakable was unraveling, not from corporate pressure, but from what had been done to her. Emma had spent most of her life learning how to hold herself together, even when everything around her felt like it was breaking. But that night, as she stood in the corner of the penthouse kitchen, clutching the edges of the counter, she felt the pressure building inside her until it threatened to spill over. Not because she had lost her second job, not because the gossip blogs had twisted her life into entertainment, but because she had seen Alexander not as the unreachable CEO who commanded New York from a glass tower, but as a man drowning in the consequences of a war he did not start and could not escape, and the weight of knowing she had become part of that burden made something in her chest fracture. She could not stand it, could not watch him blame himself for her struggles, and when he finally turned away, shoulders tense and jaw tight, she found her voice before she lost her courage and said quietly, "Alexander, I think I should resign." The words landed between them like a blow, and he froze mid-step, his back still toward her, his fingers curling slightly as if bracing for impact, and when he exhaled it came out slow and uneven, the only sign that her sentence had hit him harder than she intended. He turned to face her disbelief written in every sharp line of his expression and asked, "Why would you even consider that?" his voice low but trembling in a way she had never heard. Emma swallowed hard and forced herself to speak even though every word shook. "I do not want to be the reason your company falls apart. I do not want to be the weakness they use against you. You have worked your whole life for this, and I cannot be the person who destroys it." For a moment he looked stunned, almost wounded, as if she had accused him of something unforgivable. And then his expression shifted into something fierce, something so raw she felt her breath catch as he stepped closer. Voice barely above a whisper, but carrying enough conviction to shake the air around them, as he said, "I can survive the world. Emma, I can survive Voss. I can survive every enemy who has ever tried to tear me apart, but I cannot survive losing you." The room stilled. The city outside went silent. Emma felt the meaning of his words settle deeply into her bones, heavy and terrifying and impossibly gentle all at once, and she shook her head, trying to pull away from the gravity of it, insisting, "You do not mean that. You barely know me." But he stepped closer still, not touching her, not reaching for her, simply standing close enough that she could feel the heat of his presence as he answered, "I know what integrity looks like. I know what loyalty looks like. And I know what it means to protect someone before they even realize they need protecting." His eyes flickered the memory of her heat-stricken whisper echoing through his voice when he added, "I know what it looks like when someone stands alone in a world that keeps taking from them." Emma felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to fall apart in front of him. And instead, she tried to redirect the conversation, reminding him that the company's stock had dropped 2% today, that investors were demanding explanations, that the press was circling like sharks, and she could not allow herself to be the spark that ignited further damage. Alexander listened, but something in his expression hardened not against her, but against everything hurting her, and he walked toward the living area where Ethan Caldwell, the CFO, and 2 senior board members were waiting on a late-night call to discuss crisis strategy. Emma, not wanting to interrupt, lingered nearby, and as the call began, she busied herself tidying the space, even though it was already spotless. She heard Ethan and Alexander arguing quietly but intensely about whether Hayes-Tech should address the press directly. Ethan insisted silence meant strength, that responding would validate the rumors. But Alexander disagreed, his tone sharp as he said, "Silence only lets them fill the void with lies." Emma, without thinking, stepped forward and quietly asked, "Have you tried speaking before the rumors grow bigger?" The room fell silent. Ethan blinked at her as if he had forgotten she existed, then frowned, ready to dismiss her input, but Alexander held up a hand, signaling him to stop. Emma flushed and immediately apologized, saying she had overheard too much, that she should stay out of corporate decisions. But Alexander asked her to repeat the suggestion, his tone calm but intent. She hesitated, afraid she had overstepped, but finally explained that in her neighborhood rumors gained power when no one corrected them, that people trusted clarity more than silence, and that maybe the company needed to speak before the story became something impossible to undo. Alexander stared at her for a long, unreadable moment, then turned slowly to Ethan and said, "Prepare a statement. We speak first thing in the morning." Ethan looked stunned, but obeyed, and as the call ended, Alexander approached Emma with a softness in his voice she had never heard when dealing with his board. "You just stabilized the company," he said quietly. "Stock will recover once we speak. You saved more than you know." She opened her mouth to protest, but he reached for something on the back of the couch, his dark suit jacket from earlier, and with slow, deliberate movement he placed it around her shoulders, the gesture gentle, grounding, and symbolic in a way that made her breath hitch. "Just for warmth," he murmured, though they both knew it meant far more. Emma felt her pulse race as she clutched the fabric, a strange mixture of fear and calm washing over her. And in the dim light, she realized that this moment, this quiet offering of protection, was the beginning of something neither of them had expected, a moment that marked a shift in the delicate and dangerous path their lives had begun to intertwine. For the first time, she did not feel like a burden in his world. For the first time, she felt like she had stood up for him and somehow stood up for herself, too. The calm that followed the late-night strategy meeting lasted less than 24 hours before the storm returned, harsher and more calculated than anything Emma could have imagined, because while Hayes-Tech prepared to regain control of the narrative, Voscorp seized the chance to strike with precision, and for the first time the enemy aiming at Alexander had chosen her as the weakest point in his life, the place where a single blow could shatter everything around him. It started with an email. One she never wrote, one she never saw, one she did not even know existed until Angela from HR came rushing into the penthouse breathless and pale, clutching printed pages that looked like evidence of betrayal. The email, sent from Emma's company address to a private server connected to Voscorp, contained confidential financial charts and projections for the upcoming quarter, information only top executives should have had access to. And Emma stared at the paper in shock, heart pounding in her ears so loudly she barely heard Angela say the board was demanding an immediate explanation. "I did not send this, Emma," whispered voice cracking with disbelief, but Angela's expression was tight with fear, because the entire company had been thrown into suspicion, and Emma, already the center of rumors, fit too neatly into the narrative Voscorp wanted to build. She felt her stomach twist as she imagined the consequences, imagined being marched out by security, imagined losing her job and what little stability she had fought for, imagined Liam asking why everything kept falling apart, and for the first time she felt true panic clawed her ribs. But before Angela could say more, the elevator opened and Alexander stepped out, eyes sharp and storm dark, clearly summoned by the crisis, and the moment he saw the papers in Angela's hands, his expression shifted from anger to something cold enough to freeze the floor beneath them. Angela explained quickly, voice shaking, and Alexander listened without speaking, his gaze flicking between the paper and Emma's face, searching for any trace of deception. She met his eyes fully, even through her fear, and whispered, "I swear I did not do this." Something in his posture softened at her words, though the fury in his jaw tightened like steel. He took the paper from Angela and studied it in silence, and for a terrifying moment, Emma wondered if even he would doubt her, if the weight of corporate war would override the trust they had begun to build. But then he lowered the page slowly and said with absolute certainty, "If you question her integrity, you question mine." The words echoed through the room like a vow, and Angela inhaled sharply, because no CEO spoke like that, not in front of staff, not in front of anyone, not when the world was watching. With a tight, controlled motion, Alexander dismissed Angela to handle internal communications while he led Emma into his office, closing the door behind them with quiet finality. She tried to explain, hands shaking as she described the shifts she worked, the tasks she completed, all the reasons she would never have access to the information in the forged email, but Alexander held up a hand gently, not to silence her, but to steady her. "I know," he said, "but the enemy does not want the truth. The enemy wants to use you to get to me." The realization hit her like a wave, cold and nauseating, because she had stepped into a world where her existence could be weaponized, and she had never learned how to defend herself in a battlefield of billionaires and corporations. She watched as Alexander paced the room, running a hand through his hair in a rare display of agitation. His breaths short, his shoulders rigid, and with every movement she saw how deeply this attack struck him. Not because of the threat to the company, but because of the threat to her. Then, something happened that neither of them noticed until too late. In the middle of his pacing, Alexander reached for the strap of his watch and pulled it off in one sharp motion, tossing it on the desk with a frustrated exhale, and Emma froze, because the gesture was so unlike him that it took her a moment to understand what it meant. The watch. The one object he never removed. The one thing that anchored him now lay abandoned on the edge of the desk, as if the pressure inside him had become too much to contain. Emma stepped forward, instinctively drawn to the soft vulnerability of the moment, and picked up the watch, gently turning it over in her hands before approaching him. Without words, she reached for his wrist, hesitating for only a heartbeat before sliding the strap back into place, her fingers brushing his skin in a quiet, steadying motion. Alexander inhaled sharply, not from surprise, but from the unexpected comfort that washed over him. A sensation so foreign he almost stepped back. But instead he remained still, letting her fasten the buckle with slow, deliberate care. When she finished, he looked down at their hands, her fingers still resting lightly against his wrist, and something unspoken pulsed between them, something heavier and warmer than either of them knew how to name. The room seemed to shift around them, the air thicker, the silence deeper, and for the first time, Alexander did not look like the unshakable billionaire who dominated Wall Street, but a man caught between two impossible truths. He could not protect her from the war outside, and he could not let her go. Emma stepped back first. Chest tight, cheeks flushed, realizing she had crossed a line but unable to regret it because the moment he removed the watch she had seen the fracture in him, the part he hid from everyone else, and she had reacted on instinct, wanting only to steady him the way he had steadied her. Alexander exhaled, slowly regaining control, inch by inch, then looked at her with an expression that carried more gratitude than he could ever put into words. "They will not break you," he said quietly, "and they will not break us." Emma blinked, stunned by the implication of the final word, but before she could respond, his phone vibrated violently on the desk, displaying a message from the legal team confirming that the forged email had already gone viral among investors. The battle had officially escalated, and now they were both in the center of it, bound together by danger they had never asked for but could no longer escape. The paparazzi arrived like a storm that afternoon, clustering at the base of Hayes Tower with long lenses and shouted questions, their voices ricocheting off the glass walls as if the entire city had turned into an echo chamber of suspicion and spectacle. And by the time Alexander's security team alerted the penthouse staff, Emma had already been ushered into the interior hallway, her heart pounding as officers positioned themselves at the elevator and balcony access points. She pressed her back to the wall, hands clasped tightly, listening as muffled shouts from below drifted through the vents, reporters demanding answers about the supposed email leak, about her connection to Alexander, about why a Maid was now at the center of a billion-dollar rivalry. The noise shook her, but what unsettled her more was the expression on Alexander's face as he paced the adjoining room, trying to field calls from the legal team while also checking the surveillance feed every 60 seconds, his composure slipping with each update. She watched him from the doorway, saw the tightness around his eyes, the way his breath hitched in his chest as if the building itself had begun to close in on him, and she did not understand what she was seeing until his hand trembled slightly as he reached for a glass of water and missed. Something inside her shifted sharply, an instinct rising before thought, and she stepped into the room despite the chaos surrounding them. Alexander tried to continue speaking into his phone, but his voice faltered, and when he finally looked at her, she saw something she had never seen in him before, not even during boardroom disasters or media ambushes. She saw fear. Not fear for the company, but fear anchored deep in memory, a kind that did not come from the present moment at all. The phone slipped from his hand onto the counter with a muted thud, and he pressed a palm to his chest. Breath-shortening gaze unfocused, as if the world had tilted. Emma froze for half a second before moving toward him carefully, not wanting to startle him, and as she approached, she spoke softly. "Alexander, are you all right?" But he did not answer, only shut his eyes as if fighting something inside himself. She reached him just as he braced both hands on the counter shoulders, visibly shaking, and she realized with a jolt that she was watching a man unravel where no one could see, a man who had spent years building armor around every vulnerable part of himself only to have it crack open without warning. She placed a steady hand near his elbow, not touching him yet, offering closeness without pressure, and said gently, "Alexander, breathe slowly with me," matching her inhales and exhales to show him the rhythm. It took a moment, but finally he followed each breath a little deeper, a little less frantic, until the tremor in his shoulders began to ease. When his eyes opened again, they were dark and raw, no longer guarded by the steel walls he usually held between himself and the rest of the world. She had never seen a man wear pain so quietly. He straightened, but did not move away from her hand, and after a long moment he said in a voice that barely held together, "I watched my father fall apart under pressure like this, and no one ever helped him because they assumed he was too strong to need it." The confession stunned her, not because of what he said, but because he said it at all, because Alexander Hayes did not reveal personal history even to his closest executives. Yet, here he stood, telling her something that had shaped the man he became. She stepped closer, finally resting her hand gently on his forearm and asked careful, steady, "What happened to him?" Alexander swallowed hard gaze, drifting toward the skyline as if the city itself reminded him of everything he had lost. "The press destroyed him," he said. Voice quiet. "The rumors, the lies, the pressure. I was just old enough to understand what was happening, but too young to do anything. One night, he just stopped fighting." Emma felt her heart fold inward, not from pity, but from recognition, from the understanding of what it meant to carry grief that never fully healed. She tightened her grip slightly, grounding him, and said softly, "You are not him, Alexander. You are not alone in this." He closed his eyes again, not in pain this time, but in something more like release, as if hearing her say those words untied a knot he had lived with for years. When he looked at her again, his expression was unguarded in a way she had never expected, and the vulnerability in his gaze hit her with the force of something intimate, something that reached beyond their circumstances. Then he exhaled, the tension easing from his shoulders, and said the words that connected their worlds in a way neither could undo. "I know you were the girl in that coffee shop years ago." Emma blinked, stunned, and for a heartbeat she could not breathe, could not draw in enough air to process the simplicity and weight of his confession. He continued, quietly watching her closely. "You handed me a latte and told me I looked like I needed something warm. You said it with kindness, not pity, and I held on to that moment longer than you can imagine." She felt her pulse surge, memories returning in fragments the night she worked overtime. The man with haunted eyes ordering nothing but hot coffee, the brief moment she had reached across the counter because he looked like a person standing on the edge of something dark. She had forgotten the details, but he had remembered every piece. Her throat tightened as she whispered, "I did not know it was you." He nodded slowly. "I know. That is why it mattered." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, two lives folding into a single memory they had never realized they shared, and the room felt smaller, quieter, softened by something deeper than gratitude, heavier than coincidence. The air between them warmed with unspoken truths, and neither stepped back. Emma felt something shift inside her, a fragile thread pulling taut between them, and she knew with unsettling clarity that she had just crossed the barrier between employee and stranger into something neither of them had prepared for. She reached up instinctively and steadied the collar of his shirt. A small human gesture meant only to anchor him, and he inhaled sharply at the touch, not pulling away, not flinching, just watching her with a look that was no longer distant or cold, but filled with a tenderness he did not yet know how to voice. Outside the windows, the reporters continued shouting. The war between corporations raged on and the city buzzed with chaos. But inside, the penthouse silence wrapped around them like a fragile shelter, and for the first time in years, Alexander Hayes let someone see him without the armor he had built, and for the first time Emma Reyes realized she was the only person he allowed close enough to witness the man beneath the legend. The brief calm that settled over the penthouse after their shared confession lasted only a few hours before the world intruded again, this time not with rumors or headlines, but with something far more immediate and far more frightening. A sudden breach of safety that reminded Emma how quickly her life had become entangled with forces she could not begin to control. It happened on a warm evening when the sun had barely dipped behind the skyline and the hallway lights of the building flickered softly as Emma took out a bag of recycling toward the service landing, humming quietly to steady her nerves after a long day. She had almost reached the chute when a delivery man she had not seen before stepped out of the elevator holding a small box and glancing around as if searching for an office number. At first, she thought nothing of it because delivery traffic was constant, but when he looked directly at her, his expression shifted too intent, too focused, and something instinctive inside her tightened. He walked closer with a polite smile that did not reach his eyes and asked if she could confirm the penthouse unit for a package, but when she began to answer, he stepped too close, blocking her path to the hallway, his tone shifting from courteous to unsettlingly firm as he said quietly, "I need a word with you, miss, and it will be easier for both of us if you just answer quickly." Emma's pulse slammed in her throat, her heartbeat loud enough to drown out her thoughts, and she instinctively backed up, clutching the recycling bag like a shield as she said she did not know anything about executive property details and could not help him. His smile thinned, his voice dropping lower as he replied, "I think you do know. You work for Hayes. People say you work very closely with him. You must have access to something. Tell me what he is planning." Emma's breath hitched as panic crawled up her spine, but she steeled herself, shaking her head and insisting she knew nothing about corporate matters. The man stepped forward again, not touching her but closing the distance enough that she felt cornered. The hallway suddenly too narrow. Her exit blocked her body tense with fear. Before she could react, he grabbed the recycling bag from her hand and tossed it aside, not violently but firmly enough to show he would not let her walk away. He leaned in slightly, voice cold now, and said, "Just tell me what Hayes has on Voscorp. That is all we need." "Then you can go." Emma felt her lungs burn, her hands trembling as she kept her back pressed to the wall. She told him again and again that she had no access to anything, no files, no systems, that she was just cleaning staff, but he refused to believe her, insisting that she must know something, anything. He reached out as if to take her phone, but she jerked away on instinct, stumbling sideways and slamming her shoulder lightly against the wall. The pain startled her but also jolted her into motion, and she ducked beneath his arm and ran down the hall, her breath shallow, her feet moving faster than her fear could keep up. She burst through the penthouse door, breathlessly slamming the lock shut behind her. And the moment Alexander saw her pale face and shaking hands, he was across the room in seconds, gripping her shoulders gently but firmly as he asked Emma what happened. "Tell me exactly what happened." She tried to speak, but her voice broke the adrenaline, making her knees wobble, and he guided her to the sofa, kneeling in front of her until her breaths steadied enough for her to explain everything from the delivery man to the interrogation to the way he blocked her path. Alexander's expression changed with every word she spoke, the calm, corporate exterior peeling away until only a raw, protective fury remained. His jaw clenched so sharply his muscles shook. He stood abruptly and strode to the security panel, his voice low and lethal, as he contacted the internal team and ordered an immediate lockdown of the service floors, demanding footage pulled from the last 20 minutes and instructing guards to seal the area. Emma watched him with wide eyes, her fear mixing with something else, something deeper, as she realized he was not responding as a CEO or a man under pressure, but as someone who could not bear the thought of her being harmed. When he returned to her, his face was pale, his breaths uneven in a way she had seen only once before, and he said quietly, "Emma, I cannot let you be caught in this war. This is my fight, not yours, and I will not let them use you against me ever again." But even as he spoke the words, his phone buzzed repeatedly with board alerts, messages from executives demanding immediate statements, financial warnings flashing across the screen. And Emma watched the conflict rise inside him like a tide he could no longer hold back. The board wanted him to distance himself from her, to frame the attack as an unrelated incident, to show investors he was willing to sacrifice anything for the company's stability, even someone who meant more to him than he could admit. When he read the board's message aloud, Emma felt cold spread across her chest because she saw the dilemma written clearly across his face, the impossible choice they were asking him to make. She whispered softly, "Alexander, you do not have to choose me over your company. I do not want to ruin everything you have built." He looked at her, then really looked at her. His eyes dark and shining with something unspoken, and he stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper as he said, "I will not abandon you to save a company. I can rebuild Hayes Tech. I cannot rebuild a world where something happens to you." Emma felt her throat tighten, tears pricking at the edges of her vision as she realized he meant every word. In the next moment, his phone buzzed again, the board demanding a video call in 10 minutes, and Alexander exhaled slowly, his entire body tense as he made the decision that would alter everything. He walked to his desk, opened the laptop, stared at the company logo flickering on the screen, and then said in a steady voice, barely above a whisper, "I am stepping down as CEO until this war is over." Emma gasped, unable to comprehend the weight of the sacrifice, but Alexander's expression did not waver. "This is the only way to keep you safe," he said softly. "I should have protected you from the beginning." While Emma sat frozen, trying to understand the enormity of what he had just done, her phone buzzed from where it had fallen beside her. A notification flashed across the screen, a message from Liam. "I saw something outside the apartment. I filmed it. You need to see this." Her breath caught as she opened the video, hands trembling anew, and the grainy footage showed the same delivery man pacing near their building, glancing around nervously before stepping into a black car with a license plate painfully familiar to Alexander. It belonged to Voscorp's fleet. The attack had not been random. It had been deliberate, targeted, and now they had proof. Everything was about to change. Emma stared at the video on her phone as if the pixels themselves were burning through the haze of fear that had clouded her for days, and for the first time since the attack she felt something stronger than panic rising in her chest. Something hot and determined. A clarity that made her sit up straighter even as her hands still trembled slightly. Alexander watched her carefully, his expression tight with concern. But when she handed him the phone and he played the clip, his entire demeanor shifted in an instant, the cold, controlled CEO returning, as he narrowed his eyes at the frame showing the delivery imposter climbing into a black company vehicle, unmistakably belonging to Voscorp. "This is it," he whispered, his voice low but electric with realization. "This is the missing link. They sent him. They targeted you." Emma shook her head slowly, breath unsteady, and said, "It means they were after information you had, or they wanted to destabilize you personally." Alexander clenched his jaw, pacing once before turning sharply. "No, they wanted leverage. They thought hurting you would force me to fold, and they are wrong. But the board will not take this lightly. We need evidence that ties everything together, something undeniable." Emma looked toward the window, her heart pounding with a combination of fear and resolve, as she whispered, "Then we find it. Even if I have to go into their building myself." Alexander froze at her words, stepping toward her with a sudden intensity as he said firmly, "Absolutely not. You were attacked because of this war. I am not sending you into the center of it." But Emma lifted her chin, voice steadying, because she finally saw a path forward. "Alexander, they do not suspect me now. They think I am just a maid, someone forgettable. That is our advantage." He hesitated, torn between instinct and logic, but then his shoulders sagged as the weight of the situation pressed on him. He knew the truth. Emma could reach places no executive could without raising suspicion. He rubbed his forehead, exhaling slowly, and said, "If we do this, it has to be surgically precise. No risks beyond what you can control. We need a way inside Voscorp without alerting them." She nodded once, and together they reviewed building maps, staff entrances, and night schedules available through public records. Emma realized there was a cleaning rotation that aligned perfectly with her experience. If she wore a generic janitorial uniform and went during off-peak hours, she could blend in just long enough to search the assistant's office where the suspicious emails might have been sent. That office was linked to 2 major data leaks tied to the smear campaign. It was their best shot. The next night, with security briefed and a discreet backup team positioned blocks away, Emma walked through the staff entrance of Voscorp holding a cart with supplies, her heart pounding so loudly she wondered if the guards could hear it. But no one looked twice. She moved quietly through the hallway, passing glass offices that reflected the city lights until she reached the assistant's workspace. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for the door, but she reminded herself of Liam, of her mother's medical bills, of Alexander sacrificing his entire position for her safety, and something in her steadied. The office was dim, empty. The faint hum of computers from the hallway, her only companion. She began searching drawers, not touching anything unnecessary, scanning documents quickly for keywords. Most files were innocuous. Meeting agendas, vendor invoices. But then, hidden inside a folder, misaligned with the rest, she found a small, labeled case containing a USB drive. Her breath caught. The label read Q3 Reputation Plan. Her stomach twisted. Reputation plans were not inherently suspicious, but this one was hidden intentionally. She pocketed it quickly, wiped the drawer handle with a cloth, and moved toward the exit. But as she turned, she saw a second drawer slightly ajar, as if someone had moved too quickly earlier and forgotten to lock it. Something in her told her to look. Inside, she found printed mock-ups of smear headlines, timelines predicting stock drops, and strategies designed to push Hayes Tech into crisis. And at the bottom of the stack was an email draft accusing Alexander of internal fraud, timed to release the same week Emma appeared in tabloids. Her chest tightened as she whispered, "They planned everything. Every rumor, every leak, every attack." She took photos quickly, then slipped out of the room, heart racing as she walked back toward the service hall, her pace steady, even though adrenaline surged like lightning beneath her skin. She reached the street level and spotted Alexander waiting across the plaza, disguised in a cap and dark jacket. When she crossed to him, he saw her expression and his control cracked for an instant as he reached for her shoulders gently. "Are you hurt? Did anyone see you?" She shook her head, breath trembling but eyes fierce. "I got it. I found everything. They have been planning this for months, and they targeted you and the company on purpose." His hands tightened slightly, then he drew her into a brief, steadying embrace, not passionate but grounding a silent acknowledgement of what she had risked. They returned to Hayes Tower, where CFO Ethan Caldwell joined them to analyze the documents and video. Ethan almost dropped the pages in shock. "This is federal-level manipulation. This is a takedown scheme. With this, we can end them." Alexander looked at the USB Emma had taken and inserted it into a secure offline terminal. Files opened one by one, showing coordinated campaigns' payment logs to hired consultants and drafts of the email leak planted under Emma's name. Then came the final piece, Emma's photos of the smear timeline. Ethan exhaled, trembling. They are finished. Completely finished. The next morning, Hayes Tech called an emergency board meeting. Executives filed into the long glass boardroom, whispering anxiously, expecting to reprimand Alexander or demand he accept blame. Instead, as the screen lit up, Alexander stood tall beside Emma, displaying evidence piece by piece with unwavering calm. Gasps echoed around the room as the connections formed and the truth became undeniable. When the video from Liam played, showing the attacker entering the Voscorp car, several board members covered their mouths in shock. One whispered, "Oh my God!" They went after her. When the USB files appeared, the room erupted into outrage. One board member pounded his fist. They crossed every legal boundary. "This is criminal. This is federal fraud." Alexander looked at Emma briefly with quiet pride before addressing the room. "I stepped down because they targeted someone under my protection. But today I stand here because she protected this company when none of us knew how deep the attack went. Without her, we would still be in the dark." The board voted unanimously to launch a full legal offensive and hand the evidence directly to federal investigators. Within hours, the FBI served warrants at Voscorp, and the news spread across every network. For the first time since the war began, Hayes Tech was winning not through power or money, but through truth, courage, and the bravery of a woman no one had ever expected to stand at the center of a corporate battlefield. And as reporters outside shouted questions, Alexander glanced at Emma, eyes softening with something deeper than gratitude, something that made the air shift between them again. The war had turned, and Emma was the reason. The morning of the national press conference rose over Manhattan like a curtain lifting on a stage. Emma never expected to stand anywhere near, let alone at the center of, and as she rode in the back of the black sedan beside Alexander, the city felt strangely quiet despite the traffic, the horns, the normal chaos of New York humming far below her heartbeat. She kept twisting her hands in her lap, trying to control the tremble running through her fingers, while Alexander sat beside her with a stillness that was anything but calm, the kind of controlled tension she had learned to recognize only because she had seen him unwind once before. He glanced at her briefly, noticing her hands, and without saying a word, he laid his own hand gently over hers, not gripping, not claiming, just steadying, grounding an unspoken promise that he would not let her face this moment alone. When the car pulled into the underground garage of Hayes Tower, they stepped out to a swarm of security cameras waiting above like a rising storm. Ethan Caldwell approached quickly with updates about the press lineup, legal advisors trailing behind him, but Alexander lifted a hand and said, "Not now." His focus locked only on Emma as he asked quietly, "Are you ready?" She swallowed hard. "I do not know if ready is possible." He gave a small, almost smile. "Then we go in. Not ready together." They entered the auditorium, lights blinding reporters already shouting questions that bounced sharply off the polished walls. The board members were seated near the front, finally united, rather than fracturing their gazes, shifting between Alexander and Emma with a mix of awe, guilt, and respect. Alexander stepped up to the podium, while Emma remained slightly behind him as instructed, though the closeness of the moment made her feel as if the room had narrowed to only the two of them. Cameras clicked wildly, but Alexander did not start his speech immediately. He looked out over the crowd, a shoulder-squared posture, tall, not in arrogance, but in acceptance, in ownership of the truth unfolding. When he finally spoke, his voice carried with a clarity she had never heard from him before. Today is not about rivalry. It is not about corporate war. It is about truth. He paused, letting the silence settle before continuing. Over the last months, Hayes Tech was targeted in a deliberate campaign to destroy our stability, to manipulate public trust, and to fracture our leadership. But thanks to the courage of one person, we discovered proof of a coordinated attack that went beyond competition and crossed into criminal intent. Murmurs swept through the room as screens behind him lit up with carefully redacted versions of the evidence. Emma stood still, trying to keep her breath slow as her heart pounded. Then Alexander took another breath and said something that shifted the entire atmosphere. "This woman behind me, Emma Reyes, she did not save Hayes Tech because she had power. She did not save it because she was trained to face danger. She saved it because when she saw something wrong, she refused to look away. And because even when she was hurt, even when she was threatened, she protected this company and the people in it with more loyalty than anyone who has ever sat in a corner office." The room erupted in whispers, the kind that ripple through a crowd when something unprecedented occurs, a CEO publicly crediting a maid for saving a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Emma felt heat rise behind her eyes, not from embarrassment, but from the sheer weight of being seen, truly seen, in a way she never expected. Alexander continued, his voice softer now, but carrying farther for its sincerity. "I stepped down as CEO because protecting her mattered more than protecting my title. And now that the truth is out, I want the world to know something. I would make that same choice again every time." There was a sharp inhale from the crowd as journalists sat straighter, realizing this was no longer a story about scandal. It was a story about devotion, integrity, courage. Alexander stepped slightly aside, then extended a hand toward Emma, inviting her to join him at the podium, something no CEO had ever done for someone in her role. Her steps felt impossibly loud as she approached him, but when she reached his side, he turned his head just enough for their eyes to meet, and he whispered only for her, "I meant everything I said." Facing the cameras, he spoke one final time, not as a CEO, but as a man choosing honesty over image. "If she chooses to walk away today, I will respect her. If she chooses to stay not as an employee, but as someone who has changed the course of my life, I will spend however long it takes proving she will never stand alone again." Emma's breath caught because it was not a proposal. It was something more fragile, more human, more real. An offering rather than a claim. A choice rather than a demand. The reporters instantly exploded with questions, but their voices blurred into background noise as Emma held his gaze, feeling something in her chest loosen, something that had been clenched since the night she whispered, "I thought I was alone." She stepped closer, her voice quiet but strong enough for the microphones to catch. "I am not walking away. Not from the truth. Not from what we faced. Not from you." A stunned silence fell before the room erupted in flashing lights and shouts, But Alexander's expression softened into something rare, something warm, something she had only glimpsed in private moments of vulnerability. He did not touch her more than a steady, respectful hand at her back as they stepped away from the stage, but the gesture felt like the anchor she had needed for months, a public but still gentle acknowledgement of the bond they had built. Outside the tower, crowds cheered as headlines flashed breaking banners across every major network. Hayes Tech exposes Voscorp conspiracy. Emma Reyes. Key witness and hero CEO Hayes. Credits made for saving company. Yet, even amid the noise, the chaos, the sudden national spotlight, Emma felt an unexpected stillness inside herself, because this was not just the day the war turned, it was the day someone chose her. Not because she was useful, not because she was convenient, but because she mattered. And as Alexander guided her through the corridor past reporters and cameras, she realized she had chosen him too. Not the billionaire, not the legend, but the man who stepped down from an empire to protect her. The man who let himself be seen. The man who refused to let her face the world alone. 1 year after the heat wave that changed everything, New York moved through a warm, late summer morning with the same relentless pulse it always carried. But for Emma Reyes, the city no longer felt like a place that swallowed her whole. It felt like a life she had built piece by piece, one steady breath at a time, and as she stood near the wide windows of the Hayes Foundation office overlooking the skyline, she caught her own faint reflection and barely recognized the woman staring back. She was still Emma, still someone who worked hard, still someone who carried responsibility like second nature, but now her eyes shone with a steadiness she had earned, a confidence shaped by survival rather than circumstance. The title on her office door read, Director of Employee Wellness, a role created after the company-wide restructuring, one that she had not sought but that Alexander had insisted she deserved after seeing how deeply she understood the needs of those often overlooked. She spent her days building programs for mental health financial support, crisis, assistance protections for hourly workers, and even scholarship placements for employees' families, including one for her own brother Liam, who now attended a charter school in Manhattan with a full academic grant. Her mother's medical bills were covered entirely through the Foundation's Health Relief Fund, a program Emma helped design so no family would ever feel trapped by their circumstances the way she once had. Sometimes, Emma stood quietly at the back of the employee seminars she organized, watching workers from every floor speak with relief about problems finally being acknowledged, and she felt a warmth blooming in her chest each time, a reminder that the hardest year of her life had become the catalyst for real change. The penthouse she returned to each evening was no longer a silent glass cage for Alexander, but a home filled with warmth and noise, and small touches of color that Emma slowly introduced, from soft blue throw pillows to framed sketches Liam made for them to small plants she nurtured on the kitchen counter. Alexander often joked that the building itself breathed easier now that she lived inside it, though she always responded that maybe he was the one who finally learned how to breathe. The transformation in him was quiet but unmistakable. He no longer moved through each day with the rigid armor he once wore like a second skin. He laughed more easily, rested more willingly, and spoke openly with the people around him. He returned to Hayes Tech as CEO months earlier, but only under new conditions. He created himself, including mandatory mental health check-ins for executives and transparency protocols that prevented internal pressure from devouring the people at the top. And although the press still followed their story with fascination, the Billionaire and the Maid narrative resurfacing every few weeks, Alexander no longer allowed the noise of public curiosity to control his choices or his peace. Emma found him on mornings like this one sitting on the couch near the windows reading reports while sipping the same warm latte she had once handed him years ago without knowing who he was. And sometimes she would pause in the doorway watching him as the sunlight touched his face, thinking of the man he had been before anyone dared to see him, and the man he was now, because someone finally did. That afternoon, she returned home early carrying a small folder of plans for a new employee housing program, an initiative she wanted him to review. The elevator opened into the penthouse and she stepped inside, expecting the usual stillness, but instead she found Alexander standing near the far wall adjusting something. He turned with a soft smile as she approached, but her gaze moved past him to the newly mounted display on the wall framed with minimalist black borders. She stepped closer, and her breath caught. The first frame held the dark blue suit jacket Alexander had draped over her shoulders on the night they met during the heat wave, preserved with a simple plaque engraved with the date and nothing more. The second frame held the antique pocket watch that had once belonged to his father, polished, protected, and resting against a velvet backing. Alexander spoke quietly behind her. These were the two moments everything began. Emma reached out, almost touching the glass, but stopping a breath away because she knew what those items meant to him and to her. The night a billionaire saw a struggling woman fighting to stay conscious, and instead of shaming her, he protected her. And the day he let her touch a symbol of his deepest wound and allowed it to become something that healed instead of hurt. She turned to him, warmth blooming behind her ribs as she said softly, "You did not have to do this." He stepped closer, his expression gentle. "I know, but I wanted to remind us of what we survived, of what we chose, of how far we came." She felt something tighten in her chest, not with fear, but with gratitude and something deeper, something steady and lasting. They walked to the balcony where late afternoon sunlight spilled across the city and the wind carried the hum of Manhattan below. Alexander leaned on the railing beside her, hands brushing lightly before settling together naturally, as if they had always belonged that way. He looked at her with a quiet smile. "You know, a year ago I thought success meant control and solitude and surviving without needing anything or anyone. But now, I think success looks like this." Emma's heart softened at the simplicity of his words, and she rested her head lightly against his shoulder, the skyline stretching endlessly before them. He turned his face toward her hair, speaking softly. "You saved my company. You saved my life, in ways numbers and headlines will never measure." She lifted her head, meeting his eyes. "You saved mine too. Alexander, not by rescuing me, but by believing in me even when I could not." A silence fell between them, but it was warm, peaceful, full of everything they did not need to explain. Emma looked over the city slowly, realizing that she no longer felt like the invisible girl cleaning offices at midnight, or the frightened woman caught in a corporate war. She was someone who rebuilt a world with her own hands. Someone who stood beside a man who had learned how to open his heart because she had once told him he did not need to be unshakable. She exhaled softly, then whispered the words that had changed her life. "I thought I was alone." Alexander squeezed her hand gently until "you did not let me be." She finished, smiling through the emotion rising in her voice. He whispered back, "You never were. Not from the moment I saw you in that coffee shop years ago." They stayed on the balcony as the sky shifted from gold to violet and the city lit up beneath them, and for the first time in a long time, Emma felt complete, not because life was perfect, but because they had built something real from the ashes of chaos, something warm, steady, and chosen. And as the first stars appeared above Manhattan, Emma closed her eyes and let the peace of the moment settle deep into her heart, knowing this was only the beginning. If you reached the end of this story and felt even a single moment where your heart tightened or softened or remembered something about the way love can arrive in unexpected places, then take 1 second right now to breathe with me. Because stories like this are not just about billionaires or maids or glass towers or impossible odds. They are about all of us. About the moments in life where we think we are alone, and then someone steps in and changes everything. If Emma and Alexander's journey made you feel something, maybe hope, maybe courage, maybe the reminder that even the quietest people can turn the world around, then please do not leave without letting your voice be part of this moment too. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from. I love seeing this community from every corner of the globe come together in one place. Tell me which scene stayed with you the longest. Was it the night Emma whispered, "I thought I was alone in that overheated office"? Or the moment Alexander finally let someone see him without the armor he had worn for years. Or the day he chose her publicly in front of the world and changed everything with a single truth. Tell me what made you pause. What made you breathe deeper? What made you believe a little more in second chances? And if you have ever felt like Emma invisible, underpaid, overlooked, doing everything you can to keep your family afloat, please know this space is for you too. If you have ever felt like Alexander carrying too much alone, built from responsibility and pressure until you forgot what it felt like to share the weight, then let this story remind you that strength is not silence and healing rarely happens in isolation. If this story touched you in any way, please like this video. It helps more people find our channel and lets me keep creating long-form stories built with heart. And if you want more stories like this one's where ordinary people collide with extraordinary moments, where love grows slowly and honestly through kindness, loyalty, and courage, then make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you will never miss a story. New episodes arrive every week, and each one is written to hold you the way this one did, with warmth, with hope, with tension, with the reminder that your story is not over yet. If you have a favorite trope: Billionaire, Romance Maid stories. Second chance, love, slow burn. Emotional healing rivals to love. Forbidden tenderness or plot twists that flip everything upside down. Tell me in the comments, because I gather every suggestion from this community, and many of your ideas become full stories on this channel. And finally, if you are here reading these last words with me, thank you deeply. You being here means more than you know. Not just to me, but to the entire Soul Stories style family we are building together. Before you go, answer one last question for me in the comments, the question I ask at the end of every story. What would you have done if you were in Emma's place that night when the heat wave pushed her to the edge and she whispered, "I thought I was alone"? I read every answer. I hope you stay. I hope you come back for the next story. And until then, remember this: you were never alone either, not here, not in this little corner of the internet where we believe in love, courage, healing, and the miracle of being seen.